Today, I want to think about human mind. I noticed that there's a surprising amount of unawareness in humans about the processes of their own minds. The brain does a lot of things, but most things we never even notice, and the things that are noticed are only rarely ever understood. I want to explore this condition a bit by showing how this mental autopilot manifests by looking at three different aspects of what the mind does, namely language, how we use intuitive physics to navigate the external world, and our inner world of emotions and attraction. Language is the most important way humans transmit thoughts from one to another. We do that by forming words which are representative of the thoughts we wish to express. Objects in the external world and actions are represented by commonplace words. Other words are used to represent larger ideas. Concepts like justice, freedom, free will, honor, and even God are examples for this. Compressing more complex ideas into single terms often fails. The issue is that the idea that is supposed to be expressed may be unclear or paradoxical. It is a problem if you can't explain an idea to someone because you don't really know it in the first place. Or if the idea is multifaceted, then you may think you are communicating with someone when, in actual fact, you are not. By using one word to refer to different things or different aspects of the same overarching idea, it gives the illusion of communicating. This trouble shows itself with semantic arguments a lot. I think everyone has had a semantic argument in their life before. Whether it is your mother telling you to do your chores soon and your soon is different from her soon, or the infamous "are traps gay?" question, which is nothing more than a semantic clusterfuck. But it also has real-world consequences in the form of laws, policies, or religious doctrines. American politics is saturated with semantic arguments about the meaning of the Second Amendment, for example. And in Britain, the concept of rape, as written in law, gets discussed as some deem it to be incomplete. A lot of legal discussions are just semantics. Now, if the idea is fully formed in everyone's head and the discussion is only about which word to use, it is one thing, and a whole other when the idea itself is unclear. How are you ever meant to discuss a topic when the topic of discussion is not known? I have struggled to come up with an example until I eventually settled on the middling option of free will. We have a word for it, everybody kinda knows what it is, but there's a lot of discussion about what free will actually is and how it is supposed to work. It is not a recent thing either. The idea of free will is seemingly thousands of years old. It has been subject for many philosophers over the years, and recently some scientists. Dare I say, all of us feel to have free will, but most couldn't explain what free will is to a satisfactory degree, and even then, it may or may not exist. This conundrum might stem from the way human thought became structured in the way it did when we became humans, or even before that. A lot of human thought is made by utilizing categories. Categories are formed based on the similarities of things. We map a number of typical categories for any category of thing. This is why we can recognize a number of things to be a tree or a face, for example. This is supported by the fact that damage to certain brain areas has been shown to rob people of the ability to recognize faces. They still see normally, but the circuit that pieces together that there is a face is fried, and thus a person doesn't recognize the face. If all of our initial thoughts came about as a product of such categorization, it can be reasoned that at least some of the thoughts that came about later were also partially made by categorization. But just as we say tree to a lot of very different objects, and see a face where there might be none, these latter categories might be similarly broad and vague. This should especially be the case for purely intellectual concepts that may or may not exist in the real world. Not every idea or concept actually makes sense when looked at in depth. Humans' nearly obsessive need to categorize can be seen even today in how we sort creatures into species and people into political camps, among a million other things. But just like the concept of species is flawed because nature didn't make creatures to be neat little separate groups, and people may hold a multitude of opinions that would put them into many, potentially conflicting political camps, so may all other categories be similarly defunct. This nebulousness of underlying ideas can be observed in the way humans learn to speak, and non-human animals use language they were taught. One aspect of the early stages of language acquisition is mimicking. When a child has the phonemes down, They are able to say basically anything. This is how you get toddlers that curse. It can't be argued that the ability to say something is equivalent to understanding the concept of the word represented. I don't know when or how the understanding of the ideas comes to be, but what would happen when it never truly does? People would talk at each other in an effort to share thoughts that are not fully formed in the speaker and can probably never fully form in the listener as a result. Parallels to sign language using chimpanzees might be drawn here. The chimpanzee Washoe was trained to use sign language using a Pavlovian reward system, getting treats for every time she correctly used sign language. The trainers found that she simply did things she already knew in order to get treats without using the signs in novel but applicable situations or learning new signs. Her reasons for that were simple to understand. Why should she put in effort to learn if she can get by with what she knows? From this we can see that there was a lack of understanding for the communication Washoe engaged in. Later, after they changed how Washoe was trained, she became more flexible in her sign usage and even formed novel descriptions of things. Small kids may be similar to Washoe, but more complex in this regard, saying words they learned before the understanding of their ideas formed. This might be inevitable if the understanding can only be formed from a number of experiences. Who is to say that adults don't behave similar? Being more sure in your own thoughts allows you to better choose the words that represent your ideas. But if your ideas are faulty, no word can fix it, only mask it. What I mean to say is that you can have ideas in your head that are nebulous, wrong, paradoxical, and without structure. In most cases, you won't even notice that the ideas you hold are nonsensical. Trying to express them into words can help uncover these shortcomings, as long as you are well versed in expressing yourself and honest in the examination of the expression you produce. But even if you aren't, since your ideas of questionable viability have been transformed into words, you can use the help of others to check your ideas. There is also the issue that certain things are subjective experiences, and will therefore never cohere into a word that causes someone else to understand this experience. This is the trouble of trying to explain colors to a blind person, or any qualia for that matter. Now, let's go on to the second area I want to look at, the intuitive understanding of the physics of the world. The world is tricky and really complex, but hopefully not too tricky for us to figure out. This is where it matters that we are true in our thinking. All of us navigate the world with varying degrees of success. We casually understand cause and effect principles for the things that go on around us. Drop something and it falls down. Flick a switch, the light turns on. No need to know anything about how the power grid works or what electromagnetism even is. But we also understand that if we drop something heavy on our foot, it will hurt. If you don't subscribe to such simple cause and effect principles, it won't be long till you are run over by a bus or similar. After all, why bother wasting multiple seconds looking left and right every time you cross a street? That adds up to a lot of lifetime lost on something you consider pointless. Or maybe you will step out of a window, because it is the fastest way to go where you need to. These are simple examples of how understanding cause and effect, on a very superficial level at least, is a requirement to do anything. But once you understand more, you can do even more. When you understand how things fall down, you get a theory of gravity, and there are truly all kinds of things you can do with that, like working out how to stack rocks correctly on top of each other, without fear that your house will come down on your head. You can also calculate the movement of the heavenly bodies, or even launch people to the moon, and this is why it matters. The simple act of throwing makes the difference between rigorous understanding and intuitive understanding quite obvious. If you want to throw a piece of trash into the can, you generally have two options. First, you have a good understanding of how objects behave when thrown, and the skill to move your arm accurately enough. This is the most common approach. Everybody has some capacity to throw things this way. It shows that your brain computes some level of physics by itself. Your second option is that you have a good understanding of at least basic Newtonian physics, and calculate how you need to throw it before proceeding to do just that, preferably using an apparatus which launches reliable with predictable power. A throw that really needs to work is best done utilizing the second method. After all, the life of astronauts are dependent on being launched correctly. Such accurate actions are made possible in part by a more accurate language to express yourself in, and in part by a mind capable of processing and conceptualizing it. But what happens when you try to learn even more about gravity, or as anything for that matter? Will your language of choice be able to express what you wish to say? Or maybe will your mind be unable to comprehend more? Surely, one will give out at some point. If it is your language, you can always modify it or construct a better one. After all, you have some brain power to spare. But what if it is your mind that runs out of comprehension first? Would you necessarily realize that you are at the absolute limit of your comprehension? At this point, the instinctive understanding of things just doesn't cut it anymore. Such intuitive physics show again that the human mind doesn't necessarily need to have fully articulated thoughts to effectively act in the world. Contrasting it with the rigorous physics we have since come up with also clearly demonstrates the shortcomings of the unaware thought. Let's make one more case. I think mate choice, attraction, and emotion in general would be fitting for the third category to explore, far more instinctual than language or worldly understanding, which are both learned to a high degree. Basically, all people feel emotions, and nearly all people will feel attracted to someone at one point in their life. These are a natural part of the human condition. How is it that such a large and integral part of our existence is something that we are basically alone with, because we can't truly talk about it? Even worse, some of it is beyond our own grasp, even so it is part of what and who we are. Everybody has felt emotions before, but how do you know what the thing you are feeling is called? It is not like you can point at it and say, I call this feeling by this word. You can't make others feel the exact same thing to establish a shared reality. Identifying emotions or recognizing what they mean is not a trivial task. Otherwise therapists wouldn't have so many patients, or the profession may not even exist. Describing feelings themselves seems to be on the same level of impossibility as explaining qualia. Acting on a feeling can be done without understanding what you are feeling. The problem is not that one simply can't name the feeling, but that they don't know what this feeling encompasses, where it comes from, or what it compels them to do. Basically, condemning them to run on emotional autopilot. Who hasn't acted in a way before that they later regretted, and asked themselves why they did that? Crimes of passion are even recognized in legal doctrine, so the phenomenon is by no means unknown. One way that makes talking about feelings somewhat possible is by comparing the physical sensations they cause. Strong emotions can make you feel things that are akin to physical sensation. Extreme grief, sadness, or depression causes actual pain, and being in love gives you butterflies in the stomach. Physical sensations may be replicated by doing the same actions. There might be substantial differences in the actual perception, but at least it gives you a very vague but comparable experience that is as close to a shared reality as it can get using simple means. One way of identifying emotions in others is by appraising the actions they take. Someone brutally destroying something may be angry, someone crying in the corner is probably sad, and someone smiling might be happy. But none of these actions are actually proof. They might be evidence, but very weak one at best. An actor clearly demonstrates this. Only children who don't have the mental capacity to control their acts can have their emotions judged based on their behavior. At least the feeling of attraction that are the basis for your choice of partner are not as vague. How do you know what you feel attracted to? Well, I'd posit that you don't, at first. Attraction is a compelling force. By carefully assessing the characteristics that someone that makes you feel attracted to them, you can figure out what is attractive to you, and you may even be able to put it into words in order to share it with others. Now, the question is where this attraction comes from. There is still a difference between realizing your emotions and understanding where they come from. For feelings of attraction, the origin is more interesting than just the experience itself. Attraction could be said to be simply an expression of the genetic code of an individual or the socialization experienced, which decides what is seen as attractive. Sense of fertility, often an ability for resource acquisition, may be what is selected for, and thereby perceived as attractive. But the way these signs are expressed are dependent on the environment, and can't be a function of pure genetics. An adaptive brain was developed to cope with a changing environment, and to not be reliant on genetic determinism. Genetic determinism is the idea that all you do or can do is based solely on your genes. You are basically just a very complex machine that follows a specific programming. In order not to be a fleshy robot following its hard-coded genetic programming, there needs to be a capable software. If we continue with the computer metaphor, we could say that humans have some inbuilt circuits that do a number of basic functions based solely on their DNA. But we also possess a processor, which might be constructed according to the DNA blueprint and that derives its functionality from the blueprint, but the programs that it runs are not inbuilt. The basic tasks may be determined by genes, while the processing is learned. The societal and cultural changes of humans in the last 100 years have been large and rapid enough to leave genetics unable to catch up. That means that the same characteristics as before are still selected for, but do not necessarily express themselves in the same way they did before. If the brain wouldn't be able to step in at this point to deal with the changes of a drastically altered environment, the human species would run a high risk of selecting for characteristics which result in offspring unfit to survive in the current environment and dying out as a result. That is why I believe there to be some part being played by the brain in the selection of mates. Preferences may be biologically based, but the final selection is still a cognitive process. When you learn more about a person, you become aware whether or not they are fit for you as a partner. But how is this decision being made? Making a list of your life goals and values in order to observe, evaluate and judge the behavior of potential partners is a valid way of choosing the most suited partner. But this requires a comparatively high level of self-awareness. Also, it is absolutely pointless if you can't take an objective stance. The instinctive evaluation of behavior as attractive or unattractive is normal, which suggests that there are judgments being made that the individual is unaware of. Any form of judgment requires a set of rules, axioms, or standards to be judged against. Evaluating or judging something is a process where the state of the thing is actively compared to a set of criteria. It is important to note how something is actually being judged. If you are not aware of making a value assessment for the behavior of a potential partner, you can't be aware of the list of criteria being used as a standard. There is no telling how the outcome might delineate from a conscious judgment of the same thing. Are the criteria the same? Is the list complete? Is the rating of individual items on the list true to what you want? Your unconscious judgment could put a different weight on the fact that you disagree with your potential partner on the pineapple on pizza question stronger than your conscious self would. If this judgment is made consciously, you still have to be truly honest with yourself and accurate in your assessment. In this realm of emotions, it is very difficult to judge accurately. Just think of the proverbial rose-tinted glasses. If your brain does tasks such as judging your partner without your awareness, it can be reasoned that tasks of comparable difficulty can also be completed and used to determine your behavior without you realizing it. But I digress. The point is more that you might know what makes you tick, but that it is really hard to change what you find attractive. This in turn means that you are again at the mercy of your unconscious self. Here is where it shows that there's not really a need to be actively thinking. Your mind does things for you, and you can seemingly just lay back and watch. Now, even if there's no requirement to be aware of your thought process, that does not mean that it is good to be unaware. It might be highly detrimental, but how can you know if you can't compare it? Humans have thoughts in their head that might be wrong or paradoxical, but they don't really know, and they have difficulty expressing their thought. They have a mediocre intuitive understanding of the world that barely scratches the surface. Lastly, they feel things, but don't really know what they feel, and they even act on those emotions. They might be able to tell what they like by experiencing it, but they don't know why they like the things they do. How much of what humans do is really conscious, deliberate action, and what part is automated behavior? All these examples for a lack of cognitive self-awareness might originate in our distant ancestors. Before we became humans, we already had thought to some extent. We were social and we communicated. Early humanity had little to no need to truly articulate their thoughts. Why would these early humans even have a need for the ability to differentiate deliberate actions from unconscious ones? Evolutionarily speaking, there was no advantage to this ability for the longest time, as it requires a tremendous amount of brain power, which consumes a lot of calories in turn. A tribe of smelly proto-humans may have gotten along perfectly fine with a simple set of grunts and gestures. There would have been no need to communicate more clearly, and therefore no need for more articulated thoughts. Why would there be if food didn't require extensive planning, coordination, and teamwork to secure, and mate competition only required you to whack someone in the head a couple of times? There is a general lack of understanding or even knowledge of things that go on inside one's head. A lack of awareness for the thoughts that actually shape a person into themselves. Knowing what goes on in one's head doesn't equate to understanding what those thoughts mean, where they come from, or what they do. But not knowing one's thoughts makes understanding them impossible. I guess the brain just doesn't want to bother you with all the braining stuff it does. It may be possible to extract a basic definition of consciousness from my ramblings, but I am not confident in that. Maybe something like, consciousness is a product of self-awareness of a thinking thing, measured by the degree of self-understanding. If we adopt this definition, then a brain that can arrive at the conclusion that it is a thinking thing can be considered as carrying consciousness. There would be several levels of consciousness that could be demarcated based on the level of self-understanding, such as the ability to recognize oneself in a mirror for a very basic level of consciousness. I guess you could say consciousness is a spectrum, defined by the amount of self-understanding of all the contributing processes of the brain, ranging from nothing, no thought, like a flat room, all the way up, asymptotically approaching 100%. It would probably be impossible to reach 100% of self-understanding, however, because the thoughts required to understand where thoughts come from require themselves thoughts to be understood, and so on and so forth. I wonder where humans fall on a scale like that. We are certainly quite a bit higher up than anything else on this planet, but the fact that we need to work out and name our own unconscious mental acts like biases, and require extensive, rigorous testing to quantify them, would suggest that there's still a lot further to go. Maybe it is even impossible to rank yourself.